Morning. The camera reveals a launch pad, towering above it, a rocket, completely still, thousands of engineers, years of planning, millions of individual parts, one extraordinary machine waiting for a single moment. Everything appears ready, and yet nothing happens. Then, without warning, the engines ignite. An explosion of fire, steam pours across the launch pad, the ground trembles. Millions of pounds of thrust erupt beneath the rocket. The sound is overwhelming, the power almost unimaginable. And yet, for several long seconds, the rocket barely moves. It shakes, it strains, it fights. It consumes more energy in those first moments than it will during much of the journey that follows. Finally, almost imperceptibly, it begins to rise, slowly, then steadily, then it disappears into the sky. What if I told you? Your life changes the exact same way, not because you're a rocket, because you're fighting something just as invisible. Gravity. Not the gravity that holds planets together, the gravity of identity. Every habit you've repeated, every belief you've inherited, every success, every failure, every label you've accepted, every story you've told yourself, over time, they accumulate. They become heavier. Eventually, they create an invisible force, pulling you back toward the person you've always been. Maybe you felt it. You decide to exercise. For a few days, everything goes well. Then somehow, without making a conscious decision, you find yourself returning to old routines. You promise yourself you'll speak up more, set healthier boundaries, finally start the business, learn the skill, write the book, become more confident. For a while, it feels possible. Then something quietly pulls you backward, not all at once, almost gently. Until one day, you're standing in a familiar place, asking a familiar question. Why does this keep happening? Most people answer that question with one word: discipline. They believe they lack it. Others blame motivation or confidence or willpower. I used to think the same thing until I started reading the research. That's when I discovered something that completely changed how I think about personal growth. Your brain isn't trying to stop you, it's trying to protect you, not from success, from unpredictability. Because your brain has spent your entire life building one extraordinary machine, a prediction about who you are, what you're capable of, where you belong, how you usually behave, what kind of life feels normal. Every experience you've ever had has quietly become evidence. Evidence your brain uses to predict tomorrow before tomorrow even begins. And here's the surprising part. When you behave in ways that match that prediction, your brain feels efficient, comfortable, consistent. But the moment you begin acting like someone new, something remarkable happens. Your brain experiences conflict, not because change is bad, because change contradicts the model it has spent years constructing. That's why meaningful change often feels strangely unnatural, even when it's exactly what you want. It isn't just your habits resisting, it's your prediction. And predictions have gravity. I call this cognitive gravity. The invisible force that keeps pulling you back toward the person your brain already believes you are. Once I saw that pattern, I started seeing it everywhere. In relationships, in careers, in leadership, in health, in creativity, even in the way we use artificial intelligence. The people who change their lives aren't always the most motivated. Often, they're the people who eventually generate enough evidence that their brain has no choice but to update its prediction. That realization changes everything, because if gravity is the problem, then maybe the answer isn't trying harder. Maybe the answer is learning how to escape it. Cognitive gravity. For centuries, humanity dreamed of leaving Earth. The impossible wasn't reaching space. The impossible was escaping what kept pulling us home. The same invisible force may be shaping your life right now. Imagine meeting someone you've known for 20 years. Before they even speak, your brain has already made thousands of predictions. How they'll laugh, what they'll believe, the stories they'll tell, even how they'll respond to certain questions. Most of the time, you're right, not because you can see the future, because your brain has spent years building a remarkably accurate model. It predicts constantly, not just other people, yourself. Long before you wake up tomorrow morning, your brain already has expectations about you. Whether you'll exercise, whether you'll lose your patience, whether you'll avoid that difficult conversation, whether you'll speak up in the meeting, whether you'll write another page, whether you'll quit again. Here's the surprising part. Most of these predictions happen long before you're consciously aware of them. For decades, neuroscientists have increasingly described the brain not simply as a machine that reacts to the world, but as one that constantly anticipates it. Rather than waiting for reality to unfold, the brain continuously generates expectations about what is likely to happen and compares those expectations with incoming information. When the prediction matches reality, very little needs to change. When it doesn't, the brain updates its model or sometimes explains away the difference. That strategy is incredibly efficient. If your brain had to process every sight, every sound, every decision from the beginning each time, life would be overwhelming. Prediction allows you to move through the world with extraordinary speed. You don't relearn how to brush your teeth every morning. You don't rediscover how to tie your shoes. You don't question whether gravity will still work today. Prediction saves energy. It keeps you alive. It makes you efficient. But every remarkable system has a trade-off. The same prediction engine that makes life easier can also make change feel harder. Because your brain isn't only predicting the world, it's predicting you. Think about the stories people casually tell themselves. I'm terrible with money. I've never been disciplined. I'm just shy. I'm not creative. I'm always late. I'm the kind of person who... At first, those sound like observations, but over time, they quietly become predictions. Then something subtle begins to happen. The brain starts looking for evidence that confirms those predictions. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. Once we believe something, our attention naturally notices information that supports it. While contradictory evidence can be easier to overlook, that doesn't mean we're irrational. It means our minds are trying to build a coherent story. Imagine wearing glasses with a faint blue tint. After a while, you stop noticing the glasses. The world simply appears blue. Identity works the same way. You don't just see yourself, you see yourself through yourself. This is what I call the prediction engine trademark. Every experience, every memory, every success, every embarrassment, every compliment, every criticism, every label you've accepted feeds into the model your brain carries about who you are. Then that model quietly begins predicting your future. That's why changing your life often feels so strange. You're not simply introducing a new behavior. You're introducing evidence that contradicts years of accumulated predictions. Imagine someone who has believed for years, I'm not athletic. One morning, they complete their first 5-kilometer run. Objectively, a new fact now exists. But subjectively, their brain may still whisper, that was a fluke. Why? Because one run carries very little weight against 15 years of contrary evidence. The old prediction still has more data supporting it, not because it's true, because it's familiar. Now imagine that same person running 3 times a week for a year. Suddenly, the prediction becomes harder to defend. The brain begins encountering more and more evidence it can no longer ignore. Eventually, something extraordinary happens. The person no longer says, I'm trying to become someone who runs. They simply say, I'm a runner. The behavior didn't create the identity overnight. The repeated evidence gradually rewrote the prediction. And that's one of the biggest misconceptions about personal growth. Most people believe they need a new personality. What they actually need is enough consistent evidence that their brain updates the story it has been telling about them. Because your brain is remarkably loyal, not to your potential, to its prediction. It has lifted from the launch pad, but it hasn't escaped Earth. The engines are still burning. The climb is still steep. The greatest resistance is happening right now. So if your brain keeps predicting the person you've always been, how do you convince it into believe someone new? The answer isn't found in motivation. It is found in evidence. And that's where cognitive gravity becomes impossible to ignore. Imagine placing a marble into a large bowl. At first, it rolls freely and It changes direction easily. A gentle push sends it somewhere new. Now imagine the bowl becoming deeper, steeper, heavier. The marble still moves, but every path eventually curves back toward the center. Not because the marble wants to return, because the shape of its world quietly pulls it there. Maybe that's the best way to understand identity, not as a prison, but as a gravity well. The longer you've been someone, the more evidence your brain has collected. The more evidence it collects, the stronger the pull becomes. Not because your future is predetermined, because your past has become statistically familiar. And familiarity has extraordinary influence. You see it in health. Someone commits to exercising. The first week feels exciting. The second week feels harder. By the third, life gets busy. One missed workout becomes three become 2 weeks. Soon they find themselves saying, I'm back where I started. But are they? Not exactly. Their muscles weren't the first thing fighting the change. Their identity was. If they've spent 20 years believing, I'm not someone who exercises, then every missed workout feels like proof that the old story was right. The brain quietly says, there you are, that's the person I recognize. Now look at relationships. Have you ever noticed how people can promise to communicate differently, only to find themselves having the same argument, using different words? One person withdraws, the other pursues. One becomes defensive, the other becomes critical. Both sincerely want something different, yet somehow the relationship falls back into the same emotional orbit. Not because love disappeared, because familiar patterns quietly reclaimed control. Organizations experience it too. A company hires a new leader. A bold vision is announced. New values appear on the walls. Teams attend workshops, processes are redesigned. For a while, everything feels different. Then deadlines return, pressure increases. Old habits quietly reappear, meetings sound the same, decisions are made the same way. Change wasn't defeated by bad intentions. It was pulled back by organizational gravity. Creators experience it every day. Someone launches a YouTube channel, posts consistently, experiments fearlessly. Then one video underperforms, another disappoints. Suddenly, they begin making decisions from an older identity. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. Maybe I was lucky. Maybe I should play it safe. Nothing outside them made that decision. The old identity simply became louder than the new evidence. That's what makes cognitive gravity so powerful. It doesn't usually shout, it whispers. Go back, be realistic. This isn't you. People like you don't do things like this. Sometimes those whispers don't even sound negative. Sometimes they sound responsible, practical, safe, reasonable. That's what makes them difficult to recognize. Gravity doesn't feel dramatic, it feels normal. The strongest forms of cognitive gravity rarely announce themselves. They disguise themselves as personality. I've always been this way. They disguise themselves as history. This never works for me. They disguise themselves as realism. I'm just being honest. But honesty isn't always accuracy. Sometimes it's repetition. The more a story is repeated, the more inevitable it begins to feel. And that's where identity becomes dangerous. Not because identity is bad, because an outdated identity can quietly survive long after you've outgrown it. That's the part most people misunderstand about transformation. You don't have to eliminate your old identity. You only have to stop allowing it to become your strongest force. The problem is, most people expect transformation to feel natural, but nature has never been the goal. Think about the first day you learned to drive. Every movement required conscious effort, mirrors, signals, steering, braking, everything demanded attention. Years later, you drive home and barely remember the trip. What changed? Not your intelligence. Your brain collected enough evidence to build a new prediction. Something that once felt impossible became automatic. Identity changes the same way. People often wait until they feel like a healthy person before eating differently. They wait until they feel confident before speaking up. They wait until they feel like a writer before writing, but that's backwards. Your brain rarely changes first. Your evidence does. Every action is a vote, not for the life you have, for the identity you're becoming. One workout doesn't make you an athlete. One chapter doesn't make you an author. One difficult conversation doesn't make you courageous. But every repeated action quietly adds another piece of evidence. And eventually, the evidence becomes impossible for your brain to ignore. That's what I call psychological escape velocity, the point where repeated evidence finally becomes stronger than old prediction. Notice what isn't required: perfection. You don't need to win every day. You don't need to erase your past. You don't need to become someone else overnight. You simply need to become slightly less predictable to your own brain. Think about that for a moment. Every time you do something your old identity wouldn't expect, your brain experiences a tiny prediction error. One prediction error changes very little. 10, begin creating curiosity. 50, begin creating doubt. 100, begin creating a new identity. That's why sustainable transformation is often surprisingly quiet. It isn't one giant breakthrough. It's thousands of tiny contradictions, tiny moments where you become statistical evidence against your former self. Neuroscience teaches us that the brain remains capable of change throughout life, not because it enjoys uncertainty, because it continually adapts to repeated experience. That should be one of the most hopeful discoveries you'll ever hear. Your future isn't waiting for a miracle. It's waiting for repetition. Imagine someone who has spent years saying, "I'm terrible with money." Instead of trying to become financially perfect overnight, they make one different decision. They review their spending. Tomorrow, they save a small amount. The next week, they learn something new about investing. Months later, they've accumulated more than savings. They've accumulated evidence. One day, without even noticing, they stop saying, "I'm bad with money." Now they say, "I'm becoming someone who manages money well." Eventually, even the word becoming disappears. The identity has shifted, not because they wished for it, because they proved it. The same pattern appears everywhere. The person who finally enjoys exercise, the leader who learns to communicate with confidence, the parent who breaks a generational cycle, the creator who stops waiting for permission. None of them escaped gravity in one extraordinary moment. They escaped because they generated enough evidence that returning to the old identity became less believable than continuing forward. That's what escape velocity really is, not a burst of motivation, a new pattern, becoming more convincing than the old one. The engines begin shutting down, the violent shaking disappears. For the first time, there is silence, weightlessness, not because gravity no longer exists, because it no longer controls the journey. Most people spend their lives trying to feel different before they act differently, but the people who truly transform often discover the opposite. They act differently until their brain finally believes they've become someone new. Silence. Then, slowly, the earth comes into view, not from the ground, from space. Clouds drift across the oceans. Cities glow against the darkness. The planet turns quietly beneath us. No violence, no engines, no struggle, only motion. The rocket has reached orbit, and for the first time, it isn't fighting gravity. It's moving because it has already escaped the force that once held it down. Maybe that's what real transformation feels like. Not dramatic, not loud, not motivational, quiet, steady, natural. The people we admire most rarely wake up one morning as completely different people. They simply become so consistent that their new identity eventually feels ordinary. Think about that. The version of yourself you admire today once felt impossible. The confident leader was once the nervous beginner. The athlete was once out of breath after one flight of stairs. The entrepreneur once wondered whether anyone would care. None of them escaped gravity because they were fearless. They escaped because they kept generating evidence long enough for a new identity to become believable. That's the part we almost never see. We celebrate the launch. We admire the success. We rarely witness the thousands of ordinary moments when someone quietly became a different person. Maybe that's because transformation isn't built in extraordinary moments. It's built in ordinary ones, repeated with extraordinary consistency. For centuries, people believed identity was something you discovered. But what if identity is something you demonstrate again and again until your brain finally accepts it as true? That changes everything because it means your future isn't trapped inside your past. It isn't waiting for permission. It isn't waiting for confidence. It's waiting for evidence. Every action, every conversation, every page you write, every workout, every apology, every courageous decision, every moment you choose growth becomes another vote, another piece of evidence. One day, almost without noticing, you'll look back and realize something extraordinary. The life that once required incredible effort has become your new normal. Not because gravity disappeared, because you finally escaped its strongest pull. People spend years trying to become someone else, when all along, they were simply collecting evidence for the person they were capable of becoming. Sunrise breaks across the horizon. A new day begins. Tomorrow morning, before the world asks anything of you, before your phone begins competing for your attention, before your routines reclaim the day, do one thing that the version of you from 1 year ago would never expect. Not something dramatic, something intentional, a phone call you've avoided, a boundary you've never set, a page you've never written, a conversation you've postponed, a first step you've been waiting to feel ready for. Don't do it because you're motivated. Do it because you're collecting evidence. Evidence that your future is no longer being predicted by your past. Remember where we began. In episode 1, we questioned the thoughts we inherited. In episode 2, we reclaimed the attention shaping our minds. In episode 3, we learned that delayed decisions compound. Today, we discovered that identity isn't a prison. It's a prediction. And predictions can be rewritten, one piece of evidence at a time. Allow this message to resonate as we reflect on the journey so far. We've spent the last 4 episodes exploring how your mind forms beliefs, directs attention, makes decisions, and protects identity. But there's one question we haven't answered yet. What if, before making any important decision, you could mentally test it without risking anything? What if your greatest advantage wasn't reacting faster, but thinking further? Next time, we'll explore one of the most powerful abilities ever developed by the human mind, the ability to rehearse reality before reality arrives. Episode 5, Mental Simulations. Because sometimes the people who appear to predict the future are simply the ones who practiced it first.